Okay.
Good morning, sir. Thank you for joining us with
My
the
pleasure.
interview.
My pleasure.
First off, insofar as the agenda for today is concerned, please enlighten us about yourself. What path did your education take?
Okay, so I went to university and I read engineering science at Oxford University. And then after leaving Oxford, I decided I didn't really want to be an engineer. Okay, so I went into business. I joined a multinational called the Swire Group, John Swire and Sons, and I got immediately posted to Hong Kong, which was very good. And then I did a succession of jobs. I was employed as a management trainee, so I did a fair number of different jobs in the throughout the group in Hong Kong and outside of Hong Kong. The first job I had was actually in a plywood factory.
Really?
Yeah, making plywood in Hong Kong. And so I did a little bit of, I used some of my engineering to do some design work for form work and waffle forms and things like that. But the primary job was to actually move that factory to a brand new facility, a greenfield site on an island within Hong Kong. And so my job was primarily to design and specify the factory, and then to handle the move. Okay, so the shutdown, the dismantling, the logistics of getting the equipment there, and then commissioning, installation and commissioning, and setting the thing up. And then after that, I was posted to the group's Coca-Cola franchises in the United States, specifically in Salt Lake City, where I learned the Coca-Cola business from the bottom up, working on the line all the way through to... Eventually, I got to manage a couple of their sales and distribution centers based in Idaho and then subsequently in Colorado. After that, I returned to Hong Kong and returned to the Coca-Cola franchise in Hong Kong, where I was a brand manager for a range of soft drinks called High C, which are juices in tetraform packs. I don't think you get them here, but we were primarily in juices and soybean milk products. Soybean milk itself, vanilla flavour, melon flavour, peanut flavour, chocolate flavour, all those sorts of things. And then at that stage, British Airways was going through a revolution, and they had decided that they were going to start a branding process. And it became quite popular in the aviation industry at that time that instead of looking at aviation as an operations business, it should be looked at as a branding business. Okay, and that's when BA launched things like Club World and so on and so forth, and Traveller, and obviously British Airways first. Cathay to some extent followed suit, and because I had brand management experience, I was drawn into the Cathay Pacific organisation. But obviously I had to learn something about aviation beforehand. So I did a couple of courses, some ground school courses in Hong Kong to do with ticketing, weight and balance, that sort of thing. And then I was sent off to go and learn the trade in Bangkok and subsequently Jakarta. Brief postings, the first one, I think Bangkok was 10 months, Jakarta was 6 months. To really learn the trade in an outport environment. And then I was posted back to Hong Kong mid-year to take over a new role as manager of distribution systems. And this was to manage Cathay's travel agency distribution system, an electronic distribution system called QTAS, which was a joint venture between Cathay Pacific and Unisys to make the Cathay Unisys travel agency system, which was a small distribution system that gave last seat availability to travel agents in Hong Kong on Cathay and a number of other carriers. That got basically subsumed into the wider global distribution system business, which was kicking off at that stage. You had Apollo, which then transformed part of itself into Galileo. Okay, and you had Gemini, which briefly existed, and various other ones around the place. Cathay decided to go in consortium with 5 other Asian carriers, which were China Airlines, Royal Brunei, Malaysian, Philippine Airlines, and Singapore Airlines, to form a GDS called Abacus.
Yes, of course. Abacus.
which was based on the PARS system, which was actually Northwest's system. It now is Northwest Delta. Okay, so we used Northwest Delta hardware and most of their software, their programming, to build an Asian-specific GDS, which would go against Sabre, Apollo, and so on, like that. Which I believe was reasonably successful. It was probably as much as anything a self-defense play.
Of course.
Because the concept at that stage was the vulnerability of carriers opening up last seat availability to travel agents without control. Okay, and the issues to do with flight promotion on first screen, which was at that stage not regulated by the FAA. Okay, so you could be 5 screens back, but in your own system you could be first screen. And that was the idea, that you wanted to be able to sell your last seat availability under your terms, because they were generally speaking the highest yield seats available on that particular flight, that particular departure, but obviously without wasting the seats. This is perishable inventory.
So for the sake of efficiency, this was a necessary step?
It was. It was something that we needed to do defensively and to some extent offensively. So that I got moved, before that project was complete, I got posted in the normal scheme of things to become a route manager in revenue management for the Cathay routes that went from Hong Kong to North Asia, specifically Taiwan, which would be Taipei, Kaohsiung. Japan, we had 5 online ports in Japan, so Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Fukuoka and Sapporo. Okay. And then to the Republic of Korea, to Seoul. Okay. And they were good times to be there, because the competitive environment was not that bad. Okay, there was plenty of sixth freedom traffic, and it was extremely high yield, both due to currency and availability of seats. So we were able to, basically we generated about 50% of system turnover on the passenger side, and about 60% of system profits. So we would make, I think the last year I was there, we made something like $560 million US just on those routes. Okay.
So apart from that, you'd say that given your rich experience within the air transport industry, specifically Cathay Pacific, and as you mentioned, and given how vulnerable or rather susceptible they were to influences from the broader aviation industry, would you say that your experience, broad experience, contributed well to a career within the faculty of this university?
Yeah, I think it does, because obviously many of the students, particularly on the BDA and HND aviation management side, are interested in joining an airline. And so if there's anything that, from my experience, that I can pass on to them in terms of anecdotes or little factoids, you might call them, or something else like that, then so much the better. So that they can learn something about the difficulties of managing in the airline environment, where profits are hard to come by, and some of the techniques that can be used, or should be used, perhaps, to do that. And obviously the pitfalls that you face in a high capital customer service organisation.
If I may interject. Moving forward, going into since we are talking about the student body here at EAU, how did you feel the first time you taught a class in the then college?
Yeah, the then college. That was quite daunting, actually.
Really?
Yeah, because I'd never taught that subject, which was actually history of science and technology, and I'd never taught that number of students before. I had taught, but very much on a one-to-one basis, a tutoring, if you like, environment. So being presented with 38 happy, shiny faces early in the morning, particularly because it was summer school and it was right in the middle of Ramadan, was daunting, I would say. But because one of the things is, when you find a new class or you introduce yourself to a new class, you never really know how gripping the subject will be. And obviously the history of science and technology can, for some people, be a little bit dry, a little bit too historical. So it's always quite interesting to see how you can try and inspire people to actually learn something about it.
Taking that point, sticking with that point, since you've mentioned or rather alluded to how some may perceive history, science and technology to be dry, rather uninteresting at the same time, how would you, in that context, what would you say makes an effective instructor in order to convey to the student in order to inspire students to pursue that subject in a serious manner?
Well, I think you have to be enthusiastic.
Of course.
Yeah. And I think in terms of how you present yourself, or you present yourself to your students, and how you manage the students, you have to be very open, you have to be very honest, and you have to be fair. Okay, because as with many things in life, and particularly in university, there are tests. Tests have to be fairly applied. Results will go well or not well, depending on circumstances and how well the students prepare themselves for it. But you have to be consistent and fair about that, and open and honest. I think the other thing that is important when you're building a rapport with your students is that you should be fully prepared to admit your mistakes, whether they be mistakes of fact or assumption, and apologise and mean it, and move on. Okay. And I think the other thing which is quite important is you have to remember that you are teaching the students, not the subject.
Right.
That the students are the most important people in the classroom. You are secondary to the students and their learning process.
Right.
Okay. You've got the facilities. You've got fantastic facilities. You've got the books and the overhead projectors, and if you prepare yourself well, you will deliver. But ultimately, it doesn't matter if you can't actually get the students involved.
Right.
And that is very much more about the students than it is about the subject. So you have to be aware of that. I think quite important, very important, most important thing probably.
Moving on.
Yeah.
Given some might argue, the historical influence of these films, what would you say is better? What would you have an inclination?
My preference.
Star Wars or Star Trek?
My preference is specifically, if you're talking movies,
yes.
Star Wars 4.
Really?
Yeah. New Dawn. That is the perfect movie. Okay. But if you were to ask me about the series, then it would be Star Trek. Yeah. But I think series rather than the movies for Star Trek, because I think the thing about Star Trek is that I was around when it was first broadcast, which is a long time ago.
1969.
Yeah, exactly. So if you actually look at some of the technologies they're talking about, we are talking about now.
Right.
And that is actually quite visionary.
Of course.
Gene Roddenberry, I think, actually did a very good job with some of the storylines.
Right.
Okay. Some of the facilities they had to actually portray it on the screen weren't particularly good.
Of course.
You still see the wires on some of them, but I think in terms of something new and different, it was actually spectacular. Yeah, it's good.
Do you feel, now reverting topic again, do you feel that there are any, in your career so far at this college, do you feel that, have you experienced any particularly interesting moments in your classes?
I wouldn't say there's anything particularly momentous.
Right.
But what I would say is actually there is a certain joy that you get when you actually find out whether or not when you see the penny drop.
Of course.
When you see a student who may have been struggling with putting everything together and seeing a bigger picture suddenly sees the whole picture and sees the relevance of what you've been talking about and can put it into context.
Right.
And then you get a little light bulb goes off, and you can actually see it in their eyes, which is a great feeling. It means you've achieved something.
It's rewarding.
It's very rewarding. Very rewarding for a teacher. Yeah, absolutely. The reward, I should say.
Since you've talked about the significance of the subject, since you've talked about individual students coming to realize the significance of the subject, how would you briefly rate the significance of history of science and technology?
It's a tough one, that. Lots of people, there's no doubt you can survive in this life without any particular knowledge of the history of technology and science. I do, however, think that it's very important that we be grounded, that we have some awareness of where some of the technology that we're using on a day-to-day basis actually comes from. And I think it's also important to see the social impact of technology over time, over history. And last but by no means least is to actually recognise some of the achievements of some of the giants, the scientists, engineers and technologists that have worked in the past and the inventions they've come up with. It's, I think, fascinating.
given, since the recurring theme across our discussion has been the significance of the subject, would you feel that such an appreciation of history is innate? Do people bring such a disposition to class, or are they inspired by things like, say, hypothetically, Indiana Jones films?
Yeah, I think there is. I think everybody's different, and some people are naturally drawn to this kind of a subject out of interest. I think there is some innate need, in exactly the same way that some other people are necessarily drawn to other areas. As far as Indiana Jones is concerned, anything that gets people interested in the past, I think, is always useful. It's always good. The one proviso I would say, or the one thing I would caution you about, is that in many instances you're really talking about a drama.
Of course.
And the drama will be manipulated to meet the expectations and needs of the movie audience.
Of course.
Okay, so it will not necessarily be historical fact.
Of course.
Okay, and you can see that with the I think it was it U2 or something like that. One of the U-boat films about it was the one U571, where theoretically the Americans discovered the coding machine Enigma when it wasn't. But that was for the audience, so that's fair enough. So yes, with a pinch of salt, yes, of course.
And how do you believe you developed a passion for history? How did you decide?
I've always been interested in how things work, and why things work, and why things happen. So whether that be in the sciences, the basics of chemistry, physics, engineering, if you like, or indeed in the social world, which is history.
Of course.
Yeah, history and economics. Why do certain outcomes occur? And also the idea of the alternate history, the idea that if certain key events had not happened or not happened in a particular way, whether the outcome would have been changed dramatically.
Right.
And there's quite a lot of things in there. I mean, one book which isn't historically sound, but is quite a good book, is Fatherland.
Yes.
So you might read that and see what might have happened if Britain had fallen in the Second World War to the Nazis, and so on and so forth. It's quite fascinating, actually.
Given the fact that, under my personal experience, that such a subject tends to sort of spur a lot of discussion, but the people engaging in this sort of discourse might not necessarily follow this subject. So what would your advice be to such people who would...
Okay, well, what I would say is read. But you can read what I would call sort of light history and well-written autobiography. Okay, so if people, I mean, I tend to be biased towards the British authors, but if you look at Niall Ferguson, who's actually a professor at Harvard, he's written some excellent books about the British Empire, the American Empire, the ascent of money. You've got the popular biographers, people like Antonia Fraser, who's written various biographies. Jan Morris, or James Morris, as he was then when he wrote the books, wrote the Empire trilogy, so the British Empire, a history of the British Empire, and extremely well written and very approachable. So, and factually correct.
Sort of switching tack again, and very brief, how would you describe your disposition towards sports?
Oh, I love sports. I'm a sports fan through and through.
How would you like football? Or
I watch any kind of sport.
So you're seriously overarching sports?
Yeah. I mean, when I was a lot younger, I used to play rugby and cricket and hockey at school, and I rowed at university. Now, sadly, I'm a little bit too old for these energetic sports. So I play a bad round of golf and occasionally cricket. But now my eyesight's failed. I can't really even do cricket anymore. So unfortunate.
But on a final note, how would you, and very briefly, how would you, if you had any advice to give to the broader student community here at EAU, what would that be? What might you say?
Well, in terms of learning, and you are a particularly good example of this, is take notes.
Right.
Take notes in lectures. Don't just sit there and be a floppy jelly type person. Be active in. It'll keep your interest going. It'll give you something to put things into context when you go back and revise. I think in terms of general things, I think you've always got to be courteous, kind. Good manners don't actually cost you anything, and that's something to bear in mind. Yeah, I think you have to be true to yourself. You should allow yourself the opportunity to dream.
Right.
You should dream. Think before you act, but when you act, act decisively.
Right.
Yeah? And be decisive, because in most instances, crises occur because a decision is not made, not because it's the wrong decision.
Right.
Okay? I think that would probably sum it up. Yeah?
Well, thank you, sir,
Thank
for
you.
your time. And
Thank
sorry
you.
to keep you over time.
Don't worry, you're fine. You're fine. That's great.
Thank you.
Okay?
Yes,
Enjoy. I'll send you a